Okay, today what we're going to cover is we're going to cover the life of David Brainerd, particularly his biography, and then the publication of his memoir. And so this is going to be broken up into two lecture videos per se. So let's go ahead and look at David Brainerd. He lived from 1718 to 1747. He was the son of Hezekiah Brainerd, and he grew up in Haddam. Uh, Haddam was a Connecticut River Valley uh, provincial town that was right along the Connecticut River, but it was considered a secondary town. It wasn't one of the main commercial centers, but that doesn't mean that the Brainerd family was remote from the privilege or the luxuries that come from access to larger commercial areas. It was not too far away from either Hartford or from New Haven as well. And so David's father was a very influential man, maybe the most influential man in the town of Haddam. He definitely was a merchant and maybe the only real merchant in town. They accumulated over 300 acres of property in Haddam. And when David Brainerd's father passed away in 1727, followed by his mother in 1732, it left David and his two older brothers with quite a substantial amount of wealth. In fact, though David did not have the luxury that his older brother Nehemiah had been set aside the resources to go and attend Yale. On the other hand, David had been set aside the resources of 100 acres of land and their family home for him to live in. So he was able to be a farmer for some time. This is one of the reasons why David Brainerd actually entered into Yale later in his career. He started at Yale when he was 21 years of age, which, when you compare that to common ages of his peers or people that went before him, that was quite late. An normal entry age might have been 14, which was the age of Jonathan Edwards when he entered Yale. Others, such as Samuel Hopkins, entered Yale at the age of 12. So you can have a wide variety of ages, and what that might mean is that when David Brainerd was at Yale, he experienced some haranguing or some harassment from Yale men that were advanced in class rank, perhaps seniors when David Brainerd was a freshman, but these individuals were in their late teens, whereas David was already in his early 20s. So he felt like there was a socio differential there that didn't make much sense to him. All that said, David went to live with Joseph and Martha Spencer until he turned 18 and received his inheritance. And then he moved to Durham for 1 year to work the family farm. And then he decided that he wanted to sell all of his property and secure for himself the ability to attend Yale. So he sold all of his inheritance for £600, which should have been a substantive living for him to have throughout his time in which he studied at Yale. So in 1738, he moved into the minister of the First Church of Haddam, Phineas Fisk, in order to study with him as a tutor and prepare for Yale. Phineas Fisk passed away, and Nehemiah Brainerd, David's older brother, happened to have married Phineas's one of Phineas's daughters, and he was the one who successfully completed Brainerd's tutoring to prepare him for entering into Yale. In 1739, David Brainerd entered Yale, and he studied for a couple years, and during that time he actually had to leave Yale because he had an onset of a couple illnesses, one of which was because there was a infectious disease in 1740 of the smallpox. No, I'm sorry, the measles that was spreading throughout the New Haven, Connecticut area. In fact, uh, Jonathan Edwards and his whole family contracted measles during this time. So he goes and he recovers from this illness, but during his episode with measles, he contracts a second illness, and we find out that that is when he contracted the bacterial infection tuberculosis, which he had with him through the rest of his life, and he had to nurse himself throughout that chronic malady until he passed away from tuberculosis in 1747. In September of 1741, he returns to Yale, and in November of that year, he's expelled from Yale. Now, here are the situations under which he returns and he expelled. If you recall, George Whitefield has recently been to Yale within the last year. Now, that was in October of 1740 when David Brainerd was away recovering from measles and from tuberculosis' onset. But when he arrives in September 1741, what has also happened is another itinerant, Gilbert Tennant, had come along in March of 1741 and had really stirred up and continued the revivalistic fires that George Whitefield had really fanned. Gilbert Tennant's revivalism that happened in New Haven, particularly at Yale in the March of 1741, created a significant problem for the leadership of Yale, particularly the rector, Thomas Clamp. Gilbert Tennant had called leaders at Yale unconverted. He had called the pastor of the First Church in New Haven unconverted and actually the spawn of Satan. And so all of this created and stirred up quite a bit of conflict internally at the School of Yale, particularly between the rector and the faculty and the tutors and the students of Yale. David Brainerd and some of his close friends, Samuel Buell is among them, were caught up in all of this. And one of the things that happened is Gilbert Tennant was having meetings outside of Yale's campus, where students studied, and Gilbert Tennant and Samuel Buell and a couple of their other peers were attending these meetings and were involved in some of the preaching at these meetings. As a result, this was directly against the rules that the rector had put into place in September of 1741, in which not only should students not leave campus and go to these separatist meetings, but they should also be sure to speak in such a way that is not to undermine the authority of the leadership of Yale. One of the things that David Brainerd specifically did was he undermined one of the tutors, Whittlesley, by saying that after Whittlesley had prayed in public, that it was likely that he was as converted as the chair in this room. As a result of the combination of attending separatist meetings and also saying this comment about Mr. Whittlesley, he ended up being expelled from Yale in November of 1741. It's also told, and it's part of in the 1743 hearing where he returns and tries to give a formal defense and not really a defense but an apology and a confession of repentance for his actions, one of the things that David Brainerd had to address was whether he had said anything particularly about Thomas Clapp, the rector. One of the things that he had said is that Thomas Clapp's rebuke of Gilbert Tennent and the separatists was something to which David Brainerd thought that it was the act of Satan. Well, all that being said, David Brainerd is expelled from Yale and he becomes licensed to preach in July 29th of 1742. Following this, he goes to meet in New Jersey with the SSPCK, which is the Scottish Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. And when he meets with the leadership there, which included Gilbert Tennent and some of the other pro-revivalist ministers in New Jersey, in November of 1742, he's examined by them, and he actually goes underneath their employment in March of 1743 to be a minister to the heathens in the New Jersey area. From October to March of 1744, he is with the Kaunamik Indians. And then from May of 1744, pretty close up to his death, he's with the Indians in the Delaware Valley. During the Delaware Valley, and even with the Kaunamik Indians, he is well known as also an itinerant preacher, itinerant revivalist preacher who's continuing to have the flexibility to leave the natives with which he's been living. And he preaches to the English who are living in the surrounding communities as well on the Sabbath day, on the Lord's Day. One of the things that he has the habit of doing, he builds a English-style home each time he comes to dwell with a different Indian tribe during this time period. Over this time period, he builds 3 different English-style homes after having lived either out in the open air or in a wigwam for a period of time. All of this, his travels, his exposure, his time with the natives, his remoteness from civilization, and because of this remoteness from civilization, he is underneath a dietary, nutritional situation that is not really conducive for preserving and keeping him healthy. And so tuberculosis is continuing to whittle away at him throughout this entire period. So much to the point that he's weakened and he has to actually leave Delaware. He ends up arriving in Northampton beginning in May 28th of 1747. And he is there in the home of Jonathan Edwards, being nursed by Jonathan Edwards' daughter, Jerusha Edwards, for 19 weeks. During this 19 weeks of time, there is a continuous death watch that's being carried out over David Brainerd. John Brainerd, his brother, has visited him during this time period, and there are moments where there are very high expressions of his piety and of his readiness to depart from this world, which, if you have been reading along up to this point through the Wednesday reading, you have seen him repeat over and over again his preparedness and his readiness due to his general infirmment and weakness, his readiness to depart from this world. As you've been reading, you've also discovered that he has a very introspective personality that is very concerned about the use of time, and that use of time is used to carry out the work of ministry and the glorification of God. And he despairs often when he goes to be in English society and he is with people that the conversation does not lend itself towards revival and towards missions and ministry. And so he sometimes dwells upon the vanity of his conversation, and he sometimes also dwells upon the sweetness of his conversation with particular individuals to which he has really close connections, like Jedediah Mills, Ebenezer Pemberton. Ebenezer Pemberton is the one who preaches his ordination sermon.